In the quiet north of Europe, where the light could fall pale across formal gardens and linger on stone terraces with a kind of thoughtful stillness, a princess was born into one of the youngest kingdoms on the continent, and yet into one of its oldest habits of power. She came into the world at Laeken, near Brussels, in the summer of 1840, and she was given the name Charlotte, though history would later remember her more often as Carlota. She was the daughter of King Leopold I of the Belgians, a monarch of grave intelligence and careful reserve, and of Queen Louise Marie, whose French lineage gave the Belgian court an added note of refinement and delicacy. Around her there was dignity from the beginning, though not the careless softness that sometimes attends the very young in fairy tales. She was born instead into a household arranged by duty, measured by etiquette, and watched over by the muted calculations of 19th century Europe, where every marriage, every alliance, every courtesy exchange between courts carried a meaning beyond itself. Even in infancy, before memory had taken shape, her life belonged not only to a family, but to a design. Belgium itself was still a comparatively new state, and that fact gave its monarchy a certain vigilance. It was not an ancient throne softened by the comfort of centuries, but one that had to be maintained, justified, and held with care. Leopold understood this with exceptional clarity. He had moved through the great dynastic networks of Europe long before he wore the Belgian crown, and he brought to kingship a temperament that was disciplined, strategic, and rather cool. He was not a father of easy warmth. Those around him often sensed in him the habits of a man who believed that order must be made and kept, not trusted to chance. His daughter grew up under the influence of that temper. From him, she absorbed the atmosphere of serious monarchy, the idea that rank was not an ornament but a task, that a sovereign life demanded restraint, and that one's private feelings, however real, could never be allowed complete freedom in a public world. Yet the early rooms of her childhood were not without gentleness. Her mother, Louise Marie, brought another quality into the household, something softer and more inward, touched by piety and French elegance. If Leopold represented structure and calculation, the Queen embodied grace of a quieter kind, one shaped by devotion, fragility, and a cultivated tenderness that would not long remain. Charlotte's early years unfolded among tutors, attendants, chapel rituals, and the routines of palace life, but also under the influence of a mother whose presence suggested that royalty could carry intimacy as well as discipline. The child moved through bright rooms and shaded corridors, hearing different languages, learning how voices altered when speaking to kings, and growing accustomed to a world in which ceremony seemed as natural as weather. The Belgian court was not among the most dazzling in Europe, yet it possessed its own polished dignity, and for a young princess it offered a complete education in the visual language of power. Uniforms, ribbons, audiences, bows, diplomatic dinners, and the subtle hierarchy of who stood near and who waited farther back. Charlotte was not raised to be idle. From an early age, she showed signs of unusual seriousness, and the adults around her recognized quickly that she possessed not only intelligence but concentration. She learned the expected languages of her station, and she learned them well. She read history and religion, practiced music, absorbed the manners required of a royal daughter, and developed the composure that high birth demanded even in youth. Those who later described her often remarked on the force beneath her self-command, a quality that distinguished her from the purely ornamental image sometimes attached to princesses of the age. There was in her a wish not simply to appear suitable, but to be equal to whatever destiny might require. It is easy, in retrospect, to see in this the first outline of the woman she would become, though at the time it may have appeared only as maturity, or perhaps as a little more gravity than was expected in one so young. Childhood in a palace can be enclosed in a particular way. One sees a great deal, and yet not very much. The world arrives in fragments: dispatches, visitors, maps, tutors, portraits, names spoken with respect or caution. A princess may come to know countries before she has seen their skies, and histories before she has touched the earth to which they belong. Charlotte's imagination took shape in such an atmosphere. She lived in proximity to European affairs, but through the veils of diplomacy and dynastic conversation. The names of empires, courts, and ruling houses would have been familiar to her before the ordinary realities of village life outside the palace gates. That distance did not make her frivolous. If anything, it sharpened her sense that life itself was structured by inherited duties and remote forces. She belonged to a world where one's future could be discussed in another room, in another language, by men studying maps. Then, while she was still young, sorrow entered the household with a softness that often marks the deepest grief. Her mother died in 1850, when Charlotte was only 10 years old. For a child formed within ceremony, bereavement does not cancel formality. Rather, it settles inside it, learning to move within its rules. The court did not dissolve into visible disorder. The routines continued. The chapels remained quiet. The corridors still received footsteps and measured time. Yet the loss altered the emotional climate of Charlotte's youth. If she had already possessed a grave temperament, grief likely deepened it, drawing her inward and strengthening the habits of self-possession that would later seem so characteristic. A mother's death in such a world leaves not only sadness, but also vacancy, a silent absence in the rooms where affection had once softened power. The young princess, already serious by nature, became more clearly a daughter of her father's court, disciplined, watchful, composed. As she grew older, her place within the royal family became more defined. She was the only daughter of Leopold I, and though daughters did not inherit the throne in the manner of sons, they bore another form of dynastic significance. A princess was a bridge, a promise, a means by which courts extended influence and sealed understanding. But such language, though true in its way, is too cold to capture the private dimension of a royal youth. Charlotte was not merely prepared for marriage as a diplomatic function. She was also forming inward expectations of life, of partnership, of usefulness, of what it might mean to stand beside a man whose station required more than social ease. In court portraits from the period, she appears composed and fine-boned, with a gaze that can seem both direct and distant. Even in stillness, there is the suggestion of will. She had beauty, certainly, but more memorable than beauty was the impression of order, as though the life within had already been trained to answer to a high standard. By adolescence, she had become a princess whom Europe could notice. The web of royal families in the 19th century was dense, intimate, and endlessly observant. Marriages were watched, speculated upon, and weighed with care. Among the figures moving within this world was Archduke Maximilian of Austria, the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, a Habsburg prince of considerable charm, cultivation, and personal distinction. Where Charlotte's upbringing had been marked by Belgian restraint, Maximilian belonged to the old imperial vastness of the Austrian house, with its deeper layers of ceremony, its historical prestige, and its cosmopolitan breadth. He was intelligent, attractive, and alive to beauty, drawn to ideas, landscapes, and grand designs. If Leopold's temperament was flint and geometry, Maximilian's seemed more flexible, more romantic, touched by a certain susceptibility to imagination. To many observers, he shone. For Charlotte, the encounter with Maximilian opened a door from one royal world into another, older and larger, and perhaps more intoxicating in its possibilities. She was still very young, but not thoughtless. What drew her was not likely surface alone. Maximilian represented rank, certainly, yet also movement, horizon, and historical scale. He belonged to a house that had shaped continents. He suggested not only marriage, but enlargement of life. Their courtship unfolded under all the usual conditions of dynastic supervision, but within those boundaries, genuine attachment seems to have grown. Charlotte admired him, and perhaps too she saw in him the opportunity for a future more expansive than the well-governed stillness of Belgium. For a young woman of intelligence and ambition, there was something compelling in the idea of joining herself to a man whose position, though not that of a reigning emperor, still carried the promise of importance. It offered a stage upon which seriousness of character might become action. Their marriage took place in 1857, when Charlotte was still in her teens. She entered it with evident devotion. In becoming the wife of Archduke Maximilian, she stepped into the Habsburg sphere, where the architecture of rank seemed heavier, more ancient, and more resonant with imperial memory than anything she had known before. The world around her changed. Belgium, for all its elegance, had been modest compared with the great dynastic systems of Central Europe. Now there were Viennese expectations, Austrian forms, and a peculiar atmosphere that clung to a family accustomed to thinking in the scale of empires. Yet Charlotte did not disappear into this setting. If anything, marriage gave her qualities a new frame. She was not only the daughter of Leopold now, but an archduchess by marriage, a royal woman entering the next chamber of history. Her youth remained visible, but it was youth already clothed in purpose. It is tempting to imagine marriage in royal life as one long procession of state apartments and formal dinners, but the inner reality was more mixed. Maximilian and Charlotte, newly joined, shared tastes that belonged to cultivated high society. Architecture, gardens, conversation, travel, the shaping of beautiful environments. They moved through a world where residences were not merely homes, but statements of rank and sensibility. Yet beneath these visible forms lay the more private matter of temperament. Charlotte brought firmness, regularity, and concentration. Maximilian brought brilliance, courtesy, and an imagination more fluid than her own. The difference between them did not at first seem a danger. On the contrary, it may have deepened their attraction. Many unions depend upon contrast, and theirs appeared to offer a balance between steadiness and charm, discipline and vision. She could regard him with admiration. He could value in her a seriousness that promised loyalty and strength. Still, even in these earlier years, one may sense that Charlotte's emotional investment in the marriage possessed a particular intensity. She did not enter her role lightly. For her, marriage seems to have been not only affection and social advancement, but vocation. She wished to be a true consort, to matter, to participate in a life larger than decorative attendance. Such women are often praised when history is kind to them, and pitied when it is not. Yet at this point in the story, pity has no place. What surrounds her is promise. She is young, gifted, highly placed, and joined to a man whose future appears open. The path before them is not fixed, but it seems bright with possibility. If there is melancholy in looking back, it belongs to the listener, not yet to the girl herself. As the marriage settled into its first years, Charlotte's sense of identity widened. She was no longer simply a Belgian princess shaped by her father's court. She had crossed into a more complex dynastic existence, one that required adaptability as well as pride. She learned new rhythms, new expectations, new modes of speech and deference. She inhabited rooms in which the Habsburg past pressed gently but continuously upon the present, and she did so with the competence expected of one raised from childhood to bear a crown if necessary. Though still young, she carried herself with increasing assurance. Those who watched royal marriages understood that some women seemed born to represent, while others learned. Charlotte belonged among the former. Public role did not exhaust her. It appeared almost to answer something within her that had long awaited expression. And yet, the life opening before the young couple was not to be confined to the settled circuits of European aristocracy. There are moments in history when ambition, political calculation, and private hope begin to move toward one another from great distances, like rivers not yet joined, but already travelling to the same sea. Around Maximilian, and therefore around Charlotte, there slowly gathered the possibility of a destiny stranger and grander than ordinary royal life. It had not yet taken form, but the conditions of its arrival were already present in the age itself. Empires looking outward, nations unsettled, dynasties imagining that old forms of monarchy might still be planted in new soil. Charlotte, with her seriousness and her appetite for meaningful station, was exactly the kind of woman to feel the pull of such a horizon. She had been raised to think of rank as service and history as a realm in which persons of will might act. To stand beside a husband called to something exceptional would not have seemed absurd to her. It would have seemed fitting. For the moment, however, that future remained only a murmur at the edge of ordinary life. The days still unfolded in the language of European courts, among journeys, residences, audiences, and family expectation. Charlotte, now moving more fully into womanhood, stood at the threshold of what seemed a rich and distinguished existence. Her father's lessons had not been wasted. Her mother's refinement had not vanished from her. Her own mind, disciplined and alert, had found a role through which it might engage the world. Around her, the century turned with all its confidence in ceremony and all its hidden instability. She could not yet know the shape of the road ahead, nor the distance it would carry her from the quiet gardens of her childhood. For now, there was only the soft gleam of promise and the sense of a life gathering itself, like evening light along the walls of a palace, before passing onward into another country, another title, and another name. There are moments when history seems to arrive not with a blow, but with a proposal, carried first in conversations, in memoranda, in private interviews held within rooms where curtains are drawn against the afternoon light. So it was in the years after Charlotte of Belgium had become the wife of Archduke Maximilian, when the life before them, though outwardly graceful and distinguished, had not yet taken on a fixed shape. They had rank, refinement and position, yet not the full weight of a sovereign destiny. Maximilian, younger brother to the Austrian emperor, possessed prestige without a throne. Charlotte, intelligent enough to understand the gradations of power within Europe, would have known how delicate that distinction could be. One might belong to one of the first houses in Christendom and still remain, in some quiet inward sense, unfulfilled. It was into that space between brilliance and uncertainty that the idea of Mexico slowly entered, first as a political possibility, then as a temptation, and finally as the great irreversible turn of their lives. The world that sent this offer toward them was troubled, ambitious, and not at peace with itself. Mexico, long independent from Spain, had not found ease in its nationhood. Governments had risen and fallen. Constitutions had been contested, and the struggle between liberal and conservative visions of the state had left deep divisions across the country. Benito Juarez, leader of the liberal Republican cause, stood for one future. His opponents imagined another, more hierarchical and more closely tied to older habits of order. Across the Atlantic, Emperor Napoleon III of France watched these divisions with an eye not only to principle, but to opportunity. He saw in Mexico a place where French influence might be extended, where Latin monarchy might be given a new expression in the Americas, and where the prestige of his own empire might be enlarged under the language of restoration and civilization. Such projects are always described in noble terms when they are born. They speak of stability, of protection, of grandeur, of historical necessity. Only later do they reveal the finer and darker threads from which they were woven. For Maximilian and Charlotte, the proposal of a crown in Mexico must have seemed at once improbable and deeply alluring. It offered more than elevation, for in ordinary rank they were already elevated. It offered significance. It offered the chance to transform a gifted archduke and a serious young archduchess into sovereigns, not at the edge of a court, but at its center. There was grandeur in the very scale of it. An empire across the ocean, a throne in the New World, a landscape of mountains, ancient civilizations, vast distances, and interrupted histories waiting, so it was imagined, for monarchical shape. To the cautious eye, the scheme was threaded with danger from the beginning, for any crown dependent upon foreign arms and internal division rests upon uncertain ground. Yet those who stood closest to it did not necessarily see only uncertainty. Maximilian appears to have regarded the project through a mixture of idealism and princely imagination. Charlotte, whose mind was firmer and whose ambition wore a more disciplined expression, seems not to have shrunk from it. If she sensed the burden, she may also have felt that here at last was a role commensurate with her abilities. By the early 1860s, the couple were living at Miramar, the graceful castle near Trieste, which Maximilian had made into something like a personal realm of elegance and retreat. There, between sea and stone, surrounded by terraces, gardens, and the soft movements of Adriatic light, the prospect of Mexico became more than rumor. Emissaries came, papers were studied, arguments were presented. Delegations of Mexican conservatives, eager to establish a monarchy that might anchor their vision of the country, sought to persuade Maximilian to accept the crown. Napoleon III's encouragement stood behind the scene like a second presence, powerful, though not fully candid, promising support that seemed substantial enough to reassure and vague enough to conceal its limits. Miramar, with its terraces looking toward the sea, became for a time the place where Europe dreamed aloud of Mexico. It is easy to picture Charlotte walking there beside her husband, hearing the case repeated in diplomatic phrases and perhaps translating it inward into a more personal language. Usefulness, duty, distinction, the right to attempt something great. Maximilian hesitated, and not without reason. He was not wholly indifferent to legitimacy. He knew that a crown must be accepted not only by a faction, but by a people if it were to rest securely. There were discussions of plebiscites, reports of support, assurances that many in Mexico desired his rule. Such assurances were framed carefully, often too carefully, and later history would reveal how fragile they were. Yet hesitation is not always refusal. For a man already susceptible to noble designs, uncertainty could become one more stage on the path to consent, especially when those around him presented acceptance as a service both to Mexico and to civilization itself. Charlotte, for her part, did not urge caution in a narrow or timid spirit. The evidence suggests that she strongly supported the enterprise. She believed they could go, reign, and matter. For a woman formed by courtly duty and inward seriousness, there was a logic in this faith. A throne was not merely a glittering object. It was an office into which one poured one's discipline, one's education, one's steadiness. She was not being invited to idle pageantry. She was being invited to become an empress. And so, slowly, the decision ripened. It did not descend in a single instant, but gathered force through ceremony and repetition until the improbable acquired the gravity of fate. In April of 1864, at Miramar, Maximilian formally accepted the Mexican crown. There were rituals to be observed, renunciations to be made, signatures placed upon documents that seemed to convert longing into law. A Habsburg Archduke became Emperor Designate of Mexico, and Charlotte, his wife, was carried with him into the transformation. If there was triumph in the moment, it was of a grave and elevated kind. Those who enter a new sovereignty do not merely change titles. They step into an altered relation with time. The future begins to arrange itself around another geography, another court, another set of hopes and obligations. For Charlotte, still so young, the moment must have had the solemn brightness of a threshold crossed with full awareness. She was leaving behind the settled intelligibility of European dynastic life for something more hazardous, but also more complete. Whatever uncertainties remained, she had chosen them. Before departure, there were farewells, and farewells in royal life possess their own form of sadness. They are ordered, elegant, and often crowded with words that conceal as much as they reveal. The leave-taking from Europe was not an exile in name, yet it carried with it many of the sensations of departure into the unknown. Families embraced, advisors offered final counsels, formal blessings were given to a journey weighted with expectation. Charlotte, now on the edge of becoming Carlota, moved through these rituals with the composure expected of her. Beneath that composure, one can imagine many things: anticipation, fatigue, exaltation, perhaps a hidden apprehension too indistinct to be spoken. There is always something lonely in the act of crossing an ocean toward a destiny that others have praised. At the very moment when one is most admired, one is also most alone with one's decision. The voyage itself began in the spring of 1864, when Maximilian and Charlotte embarked upon the long sea passage that would carry them from Europe to the shores of Mexico. The vessel that bore them away moved through a world of wind, salt, and widening distance. To those who have never left one continent for another by sea, it can be difficult to imagine how decisive such a journey once felt. There was no quick return, no easy exchange between one capital and the next. The ocean imposed reflection. It loosened the familiar ties of daily life and suspended the traveller between identities. Charlotte, standing perhaps at the rail in the evenings, watching the line where sea met sky dissolve into colour and then into darkness, would have had time enough to think of Belgium, of Austria, of the carefully enclosed rooms in which she had first learned what it meant to belong to history. All of that now receded behind her. Ahead lay a land she knew chiefly through reports, maps, and the ardent language of political invitation. At sea, royal life loses some of its ornament and becomes curiously intimate. The public forms remain, but they are compressed into the finite space of a ship. Days are marked by meals, conversations, reading, prayer, and the measured passage of weather. One sees the same horizon again and again, and under that repetition thought becomes quieter, more inward. For Charlotte, this interval may have been one of the last calm spaces before the demands of empire closed around her. She had accepted a crown, but had not yet touched the soil on which it would stand. She was neither fully European princess nor yet Mexican empress, but suspended between the two. Such intervals often hold a peculiar tenderness in retrospect, because they preserve hope before reality begins its patient corrections. She and Maximilian were still joined in anticipation, still able to imagine their reign as something noble, perhaps even restorative. The sea around them, vast and indifferent, carried both their confidence and the first faint echo of future solitude. As the ship advanced westward, the scale of their undertaking must have deepened in feeling. Mexico was not merely distant in miles. It belonged to another historical atmosphere. For Europeans of their rank, the country represented at once antiquity and novelty, empire and republic, Catholic inheritance and revolutionary struggle. It possessed a landscape unlike the one they had known, a social complexity they could not yet fully grasp, and a history rich enough to command reverence even from those arriving in presumption. Charlotte, with her serious mind and cultivated habits, was not a woman likely to remain content with superficial impressions. Even before arrival, one imagines her reading, listening, asking questions, trying to form an inner picture of the place where she was to reign. She was traveling not toward a decorative title, but toward a nation whose past and present were densely layered. Whatever errors accompanied the imperial project, it would matter later that she approached Mexico not wholly as a stage, but with a wish, however imperfect, to know it. When at last the coast came into view, the voyage gave way to arrival, and arrival is always more earthly than expectation. The sea journey had then closed the imperial dream in a kind of floating stillness. Land restored weight, climate, dust, distance, and human complexity. Maximilian and Charlotte landed at Veracruz in late May of 1864, received according to the forms arranged for them, though not by the universal acclamation some in Europe had led them to expect. Veracruz, with its heat, brightness, and port activity, could not have resembled the courts from which they came. It belonged to another order of life, one less softened by dynastic familiarity, more immediate in its physical presence. The newly arrived sovereigns were confronted not only by ceremony, but by atmosphere itself. Different light, different air, different architecture, different cadences of speech. Such first impressions do not always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they settle upon the traveller in layers, as if a new country enters the senses one veil at a time. From the coast, they began the long progress inland toward the capital, moving toward the high valley where Mexico City lay under its broad sky. This journey through the interior offered them a first unfolding encounter with the country they had come to rule. Roads wound upward, landscapes altered, villages, plains, mountains, and cultivated ground passed before them, not as abstractions, but as live terrain. There is a special kind of silence that can overtake those who travel through a land on which great hopes have been laid, especially when that land is still unknown to them in its inward life. Charlotte, watching from carriage windows or pausing at prepared receptions along the way, would have seen beauty certainly, and strangeness, and perhaps signs that the nation entrusted to them was not one thing, but many. Every empire imagines itself capable of gathering variety into order. Yet the first act of seeing often reveals how large the task truly is. By the time they approached Mexico City in June, the ceremonial dimension of their new identity had fully asserted itself. They entered not as visitors, but as emperor and empress. The capital, with its long colonial memory, its churches, plazas, and administrative gravity, offered the setting in which the imperial fiction could most convincingly dress itself as permanence. There were receptions, processions, formalities, and the elaborate visual language by which power announces its presence even when its foundations remain uncertain. For Charlotte, now increasingly known as Carlota, the title of Empress ceased to be an anticipation and became a condition of daily life. Her bearing, always composed, would have suited such a transition. She knew how to receive, how to observe, how to occupy ceremonial space without seeming overwhelmed by it. Yet even at this early moment, one can sense the delicate contrast at the heart of the scene. The court appeared established, but the nation beyond it was contested. The crown had been accepted, but legitimacy was not complete simply because it had been enacted beautifully. Still, it would be wrong to strip these first weeks of their genuine radiance. For Carlota and Maximilian, the beginning of the empire must have possessed a real emotional power. They had crossed an ocean to claim a destiny they believed could be made honorable. They were young enough to believe that dignity, intelligence, and goodwill might shape events more deeply than force alone. They inhabited palaces, received homage, and looked out over a city whose history stretched back far before their own European houses had imagined ruling there. The dream was not insincere simply because it was fragile. Carlota, in particular, seems to have entered her role with earnestness. She had not come to drift through ceremony. She had come to reign, to learn, to labor, and to justify by seriousness the audacity of her new title. That seriousness, still luminous in the first season of empire, gave her beginning in Mexico its particular pathos. She was not playing at sovereignty, she meant it. And yet the shadow existed from the first, though at first it lay almost invisibly along the edge of the picture. The empire depended upon French force more than its ceremonies admitted. Juarez and the Republican cause had not vanished. The support offered by Mexican conservatives, though passionate in some circles, did not bind the nation into consent. Beneath the grace of receptions and the splendor of official dwellings, one could already detect the instability of a throne established through intervention and hope. But such truths do not always reveal themselves fully to those who have just arrived. In the early days, one sees what one can bear to see. Carlota, stepping through halls prepared for her, listening to voices in a language she would soon work to master, looking upon paintings, altars, courtyards, and distant mountain light, may still have felt above all the solemn wonder of arrival. The future had opened. It was enough, for the moment, that the opening be beautiful. So the second life began, the life that would take her far beyond the measured courts of Belgium and Austria, into a country both older and more unsettled than the dream that had summoned her there. The Atlantic now lay behind her like a closed chapter of water. Before her rose the duties of an empress in a land not yet her own, and perhaps never fully willing to be possessed by any imported crown. Yet in those first quiet evenings when ceremony had withdrawn and the rooms grew still, when the unfamiliar city settled beneath the night and the mountain air moved softly through high windows, there may still have been peace enough for hope. Carlota had crossed into another world, and for a little while that world answered her not with ruin, but with promise, delicate and resplendent, like a lamp kept burning against a vast and uncertain dark. The first months of Carlota's life in Mexico unfolded beneath a light unlike any she had known in Europe, a light at once high and delicate, clear in the morning and softened by evening into long lavender shadows that rested upon stone, courtyard, and mountain. After the salt brightness of Veracruz and the ascent inland, Mexico City must have seemed suspended between splendor and distance, raised above the sea in a valley where the air carried both coolness and dust, and where old imperial memories lingered under the newer language of nationhood. For a young empress newly arrived from Europe, everything was at once ceremonious and strange. There were receptions to attend, uniforms and formal addresses, clergy and dignitaries, halls arranged for sovereign presence, and the unending labour by which a court seeks to persuade others, and perhaps itself, that it is secure. Yet beneath those public forms another process had already begun, slower and more intimate. Carlota, who had crossed the Atlantic not merely to wear a title but to inhabit it, set herself to the work of understanding the country that had become the centre of her fate. There are some people who move through unfamiliar places by preserving themselves intact, carrying their native world around them like a sealed chamber. Carlota does not seem to have been content with that. She came from a life of rank and ritual, certainly, and she never ceased to be a European princess in manner, education, and instinct. But she was not indifferent to the land she had entered. The evidence of her early Mexican years suggests not detachment, but effort. She learned Spanish with seriousness, and not as a superficial accomplishment meant only to adorn a public role. Language, for anyone who uses it earnestly, is an act of approach. It is a way of stepping closer to the minds of others, of softening the distance created by birth, accent and rank. One can imagine her in the quiet hours of the morning, before audiences and formal engagements, bent over papers, repeating phrases, listening carefully, disciplining herself to the cadences of a tongue that would soon be required of her in speech, correspondence, and ceremony. Such study does not make a foreign sovereign native, but it does reveal intention, and Carlota's intention was not to remain aloof. As her Spanish improved, the country around her began to lose some of its first dreamlike indistinctness and take on outline, tone, and inner character. Mexico could no longer remain merely the grand object of an imperial design. It became a place of names, histories, devotions, local memories, and visible inheritances older than the regime she and Maximilian had come to lead. Carlota showed a genuine interest in Mexican history, art, and culture, and this too deserves to be understood in its full texture. She had been formed in courts that valued lineage and historical continuity, so it is not surprising that she should be drawn toward the deep and layered past of the country before her. Here was a nation whose memory did not begin with the empire she had joined. It reached backward through the vice-regal centuries into an older indigenous antiquity, and outward through churches, archives, monuments, paintings, libraries, and traditions of devotion that gave the land a solemn richness of its own. Carlota, for whom royalty had always been linked to history, seems to have recognized that if she were to reign with dignity, she must learn to perceive Mexico not as a blank setting for European aspiration, but as a civilization marked by its own grandeur and sorrow. Court life, meanwhile, gathered around the imperial couple with the deliberate beauty of a performance prepared in haste and yet meant to appear eternal. Mexico City offered them the National Palace, with its long governmental memory, but also Chapultepec, rising above the city with its broad views, its high air, and its sense of remove. Chapultepec in particular seems suited to the emotional atmosphere of Carlota's reign, for it combined majesty with a certain exposed loneliness. From its terraces and windows, one could look out over the valley, over roofs, roads, church towers, and distant hills, as if the empire itself were spread beneath the gaze, and yet never fully within one's grasp. Carlota moved through these spaces not as an idle ornament, but as a woman intent upon shaping an imperial household of order and distinction. Rooms had to be arranged, ceremonies calibrated, receptions given tone, the visual life of monarchy translated into surroundings already full of their own historical echoes. All this belonged to the language of power, but also to the more fragile art of making strangers appear settled in a country that still regarded them with mixed feeling. There must have been moments, in those early months, when the beauty of the setting itself seemed enough to support belief. The gardens of Chapultepec, the cool interiors after sun-filled courtyards, the chapel silence of old churches, the mountain light falling across the city in the late afternoon, all these could persuade the mind that destiny had indeed carried her somewhere worthy of devotion. Carlota's temperament was not careless, but neither was it barren of response. She was capable of admiration. The visual and ceremonial richness of Mexico, with its fusion of indigenous depth, colonial gravity, and vivid living culture, would have offered much to hold her attention. One pictures her pausing before paintings and carved altars listening to music in church interiors fragrant with wax and incense, observing textiles, flowers, silverwork, architectural details, and the countless signs by which a nation expresses itself through beauty. Her interest in Mexican art was not, so far as one can judge, a passing curiosity. It formed part of her larger desire to enter the life of the country seriously, to be not only obeyed, if obedience could be won, but in some measure connected. Yet the very sincerity of that wish gave these months their quiet poignancy. To belong is not always the same as to be accepted, and to admire a country is not the same as to dissolve the conditions under which one has come to rule it. Carlota could study Mexico, learn its language, take pleasure in its art, and feel reverence for its history, and still remain the empress of a contested imperial project sustained by forces not wholly Mexican and not wholly secure. But such contradictions do not always present themselves at once. Often they remain in the background while daily life takes precedence. There were interviews to grant, people to receive, clergy to greet, papers to read, formal journeys to consider, and small acts of courtly adaptation through which an imported monarchy attempted to root itself. Carlota's gifts were especially well suited to this part of the work. She had poise without languor, discipline without visible hardness, and a sincere respect for the office she held. When she appeared in public, she gave the impression not of frivolous excitement, but of composure under obligation. That alone could inspire confidence in those inclined to see hope in the empire. In her marriage too, these Mexican months clarified what had perhaps always been true. Maximilian retained his charm, his cultivated tastes, his breadth of interest, and his tendency to approach public life with an idealizing imagination. He could be gracious, thoughtful, and sincerely drawn toward generous solutions, but he also carried within him a certain fluidity, a tendency to drift between vision and circumstance. Carlota, by contrast, seemed to grow, firmer in action as responsibility increased. Where he dreamed, she organized. Where he was drawn by possibility, she was steadied by duty. The difference need not be overstated, for they were still partners in the imperial experiment, still united by a shared conviction that their reign might mean something substantial. Yet, from an early stage, one senses that Carlota grasped the practical weight of sovereignty in a more concentrated way. She did not merely enjoy the forms of rule, she wished to justify them through labor. The deeper she entered Mexico, the more the role of empress became for her a vocation, rather than a condition of rank. That vocation expressed itself in many quiet ways. Her improvement in Spanish allowed her to move more directly within the ceremonial life of the country, to hear and respond with less mediation, and therefore with greater dignity. Her interest in Mexican history gave shape to her curiosity. She was not content with the surface of court etiquette, when a deeper continuity beckoned beneath it. The old colonial city, with its cathedrals and convent walls, its plazas marked by centuries of power and devotion, invited reflection on the many sovereignties that had risen and faded there. Carlota lived among these accumulated histories, aware perhaps that the title she bore was new, even fragile, while the stones around her were old. For some temperaments such awareness would have produced distance. In her it seems to have produced effort. If the empire was to endure, then it must in some degree respect what had come before it. Her attraction to Mexican culture, then, was not separable from her larger political instinct. She understood that rule without knowledge remains hollow, and that monarchy, if it sought reverence, could not appear deaf to the land it claimed. Outside the palaces and official residences stretched a country whose daily life could not be contained within imperial interiors. There were villages, provinces, roads, estates, marketplaces, local devotions, regional customs, and countless forms of belonging invisible to state ceremony. Carlota did not know all this intimately, nor could she. No sovereign, least of all one newly arrived and encircled by protocol, can simply step outside the architecture of power and enter national life unguarded. But she seems to have possessed a clearer wish than many in her position, to narrow that distance where she could. Her effort to learn, to observe, to take interest, and to treat Mexico as more than a stage for imported monarchy, gave her conduct a seriousness that even critics could not wholly dismiss. The tragedy of her story lies partly here, in the fact that her investment in the country was not wholly artificial. She had begun to give Mexico something real, attention, study, and an inward allegiance that deepened as the months passed. The imperial court also developed a seasonal rhythm, and within that rhythm, Carlota's attachment to place may have grown. Chapultepec, with its elevated calm, offered one vision of imperial life. Other residences and journeys brought others. In quieter intervals, away from the most public formalities, she would have encountered the textures that sometimes matter more than official declarations. The scent of gardens after rain, the changing quality of morning air at altitude, the movement of servants through long corridors, the tolling of bells across the city, the slight hush that enters a room when a sovereign has withdrawn and only the after-presence of authority remains. It is often through such repeated, nearly private impressions that a country begins to enter the heart of someone who did not expect to belong to it. Mexico ceased to be merely the destination of a voyage. It became the setting of her days, the landscape to which her eyes adjusted, the language she was training her. Mouth to speak, the history she sought to read into the present. An adopted life, however uncertain, was taking root around her. And still, beneath this process of belonging, there was unease, not always visible, but never absent. The empire had been born from division, and division does not vanish because the court has found its equilibrium. Benito Juarez and the Republican cause remained beyond the polished horizon of imperial life, and French arms still underwrote much. That ceremony preferred to leave unspoken. Carlota surely understood at least part of this. She had not been raised to mistake elegance for security. If she gave herself to Mexico with seriousness, it was not because she was blind to difficulty, but because she believed difficulty might yet be mastered by purpose. Here lay one of the deepest currents of her character. She did not retreat from strain when duty required effort. She leaned toward it. The very instability of the imperial project may have strengthened her resolve to serve it well. In calmer souls, such determination can appear noble. In more sorrowful retrospect, it appears almost unbearably tender. In these months, then, Carlota was becoming something more than the European princess who had crossed the Atlantic in brilliant expectation. She was becoming, in her own mind and conduct, an empress who had entered into relation with Mexico itself, not wholly, not seamlessly, not without all the limits of her foreign birth and political situation, but with sincerity. She learned, watched, read, listened, arranged, received, and tried to place herself within the moral and historical landscape of the country she had come to govern. If some of those around her still saw only imported sovereignty draped in local ceremony, she herself seems to have imagined a more earnest bond. The title Carlota, increasingly used in Mexico, marked not merely a translation of name, but a gradual shift of identity. Charlotte of Belgium was not erased, but she had been carried into another register of life, one in which the sound of church bells in the capital, the cadence of Spanish, and the sight of Mexican light on high stone had begun to shape her days. There is a melancholy sweetness in such beginnings, because they shine most brightly just before care grows heavy. But in the chapter of her life now unfolding, melancholy had not yet taken command. What remained foremost was still the patient radiance of effort. Carlota walked through a country she wished to know, beside a husband with whom she still shared a demanding dream, and under a crown that, for all its uncertainty, had not yet revealed its full burden. The valley evenings descended softly around the imperial residences. Lamps were lit, voices quieted in adjoining rooms. Somewhere beyond the windows, the city continued in its own vast life, ancient and contemporary at once, while above it the mountain air carried the coolness of night. In that calm, with papers set aside and ceremony resting for a few hours, Mexico may have seemed not merely a distant political undertaking, but a place to which she had already entrusted something of her mind, her discipline, and her hope. As the first brightness of imperial arrival began to settle into habit, the life that had seemed at a distance almost theatrical revealed itself as work. Crowns, once worn for a season beneath the clear light of ceremony, begin to acquire another texture, one less visible and far heavier. In Mexico, Carlota discovered that sovereignty was not composed only of entrances, receptions, and carefully arranged images of permanence, but of letters, audiences, petitions, appointments, anxieties carried across provinces, and the persistent labor of trying to give a fragile order the appearance, and if possible, the reality of endurance. She had not come to the country for ornament, and now the deeper truth of that intention emerged. The Empress, who had studied Spanish, who had tried to understand the land and its historical depth, turned with equal seriousness toward the daily burdens of rule. What had first appeared as an imperial dream now became a discipline of attention, and it was in that discipline that Carlota's character showed itself most clearly. There are people who rise to public office by instinctively protecting some private core of themselves from its demands, offering grace and presence while leaving the true weight to others. Carlota does not seem to have governed her life in that manner. The responsibilities of empire called out not withdrawal, but concentration. Her upbringing had prepared her, perhaps more than anyone around her yet fully understood, for a world in which rank meant vigilance. At the Belgian court, she had learned early that monarchy, especially when not cushioned by immemorial security, depends upon form, constancy, and the ability to remain composed while uncertainty moves nearby. In Mexico, these lessons, once abstract and almost ceremonial, became living instruments. She applied herself to correspondence, to formal interviews, to the careful reading of reports, and to the ceremonial obligations through which power maintained contact with its servants and petitioners. The gestures remained elegant, but beneath them lay effort, and effort steadily converted the young empress from a symbol into a participant. Maximilian, for all his intelligence and charm, approached monarchy with a temperament different from hers. He could be drawn by large possibilities, by visions of enlightened rule, by the hope that generosity and princely breadth might soften conflict or elevate politics beyond its harsher realities. He dreamed with sincerity, which is perhaps why his dreams later carried such sadness. Carlota, though capable of idealism, seems to have been made of sterner material in practice. She felt the daily texture of power more immediately. Where Maximilian could still imagine monarchy as a benevolent shaping force moving through a wide historical landscape, Carlota more often encountered it as a sequence of obligations requiring decision, precision, and steadiness of nerve. This difference between them did not yet amount to estrangement. They remained joined in purpose, and each needed the other's gifts. Yet those who observed closely could begin to sense that if the empire were to stand at all through strain, it would depend in no small part on Carlota's capacity for work. The court around them, though designed to radiate confidence, lived in a state of permanent adjustment. Every audience, every decree, every movement between residences participated in the effort to make the imperial government appear settled in a nation that had not wholly granted it repose. Officials arrived with matters requiring judgment. Clergymen came with concerns both pastoral and political. Military developments in the provinces altered the atmosphere of a room before a word was spoken. Regional reports carried the uneven pulse of support and resistance. Such rhythms, repeated day after day, made clear that the empire could never rest merely on appearance. The court had to act, respond, and continue speaking in the language of sovereignty, even where sovereignty remained contested. Carlota, with her calm exterior and disciplined habits, proved especially suited to sustaining that language. She received visitors with gravity, listened with a queenly attentiveness that was more than performance, and gave to her role a seriousness that must have impressed even those unsure of the regime itself. At times this seriousness drew her beyond the conventional limits expected of an empress. Maximilian's absences from the capital, whether for tours, inspections, or the broad political movement demanded by his position, left spaces in which authority had to be exercised rather than merely displayed. It was in such intervals that Carlota acted as regent, and these periods reveal much about her nature. Regency is a delicate office, poised between substitution and continuity. One rules in another's name, but one must do so with enough firmness that the machinery of government does not lose momentum. Carlota stepped into that role not with visible hesitation, but with the composed exactness of someone who had long believed that responsibility should be met directly when it arrived. She chaired councils, reviewed matters of state, and presented herself not as a placeholder waiting passively for the emperor's return, but as a guardian of imperial continuity. In those days, perhaps more than at any other time, her capacities came into sharp relief. She seemed not diminished by responsibility, but sharpened by it. To imagine her during these regencies is to picture not a woman intoxicated by power, but one sobered by it. Morning would begin with papers, reports, and appointments, the formal quiet of a palace gradually filling with the movement of attendants, ministers, and messengers. The hours would pass beneath the disciplined routine of governance, marked not by dramatic gesture, but by the patient sorting of demands. There would have been questions of administration, finance, appointments, relations with military authorities, and the endless negotiation between imperial intention and provincial reality. Carlota's command of Spanish, improved through effort, allowed her to inhabit these duties with increasing directness. Language reduced the veil between ruler and ruled, at least within the formal spaces where government spoke to itself. Her very manner of listening, one imagines, would have reinforced the impression that she took the office seriously and expected others to do the same. The empire may have been uncertain, but under her regency it could still feel, for moments at least, orderly. Yet the deeper difficulty remained, and it deepened quietly with every month. The Second Mexican Empire had been conceived through a combination of foreign ambition and domestic division, and those origins could not be dissolved by the good faith of its sovereigns. Benito Juárez's republican government endured, displaced but not extinguished, sustained by conviction, by regional networks of support, and by a legitimacy of its own that imperial ceremony could not erase. Across the country, liberal resistance continued in forms both organized and diffuse. Roads could become uncertain. Provinces could be obedient in proclamation and unsettled in truth. The imperial center, however refined, existed within a landscape of fractured loyalties. Carlota, because she was too intelligent to mistake pageantry for consent, must have felt this more keenly over time. Her work as empress was never performed against a background of settled peace. It was undertaken in the midst of a nation whose political soul remained contested, and over all this lay the indispensable fact of French support. However noble Maximilian's intentions, however earnest Carlota's efforts to inhabit Mexican sovereignty with dignity, the empire depended in crucial measure upon the presence of French military force. That dependence was one of the most painful contradictions at the heart of their reign. An empire claiming legitimacy from the invitation of Mexican conservatives and the promise of national renewal, nonetheless rested, in practice, upon soldiers sent by Napoleon III. The contradiction may have been most visible to those who opposed the empire, but it could not have been wholly invisible to the imperial couple themselves. Carlota, who had been raised to understand the architecture of power, likely grasped that support borrowed from abroad carries with it a hidden fragility. One may be upheld by another empire's interests only so long as those interests remain aligned, and such alignments are rarely faithful. To govern under that condition is to feel, however quietly, that one's throne stands upon both ceremony and uncertainty. Even so, Carlota did not retreat into despair. The remarkable thing in these middle years of the empire is not that she foresaw every danger, but that she continued to work with such seriousness despite danger. In official life, she appears as a woman increasingly given over to duty. She read, answered, intervened, represented, and upheld. She was not merely beside the emperor. She had become one of the active instruments through which the regime sought coherence. Her intelligence, so evident in youth, matured here into administrative force. If she had once been drawn to monarchy as a grand horizon worthy of ambition, she was now learning its interior weather, the fatigue, the repetitive strain, the need to maintain composure when certainty cannot be guaranteed. Such knowledge rarely produces radiance, but it can produce authority of a different and more poignant kind. Carlota's authority in Mexico was born not from ease, but from sustained exertion. The physical settings of the imperial life, with all their beauty, only sharpened the contrast. Chapultepec, rising above the city in its hilltop solitude, retained its air of lofty stillness. But stillness is not peace when the mind is occupied by state burdens. The broad views over the valley, the long corridors, the softened light entering high rooms, the formal gardens and terraces touched by afternoon shadow. All these belong to the external poetry of empire. Within them ministers conferred, documents accumulated, and political unease moved like an undercurrent beneath grace. The national palace, too, with its older governmental gravity, reminded the imperial couple that they ruled not in emptiness, but amid the remains of other sovereignties and other claims to command. For Carlota, these surroundings must have become almost double in meaning. They were beautiful, yes, and worthy of reverence, yet they were also the settings in which the burden of legitimacy was performed and tested. Beauty did not cancel strain. It framed it. There were likely hours in which she found brief relief in the same cultural and historical interests that had first drawn her toward Mexico more deeply. Art, architecture, devotional spaces, and the vast historical atmosphere of the country could still offer her a form of inward anchorage. To pause before a painting, to walk in a garden, to look out over the valley at dusk, to hear church bells extending their sound over the city, might briefly restore a sense that the work of empire was attached to something larger than its immediate crises. Yet even such quiet moments would have been tinged by awareness. The land she had tried to know was also the land in which the imperial project daily encountered its limits. Her affection for Mexico, insofar as it had become real, did not protect her from political sorrow. If anything, it may have deepened it, for she was no longer dealing with an abstract realm. She had come to care for the country in a manner available to her, and caring made difficulty more intimate. Around Carlota, those who served the empire would have read her presence as a source of steadiness. Courts are finely sensitive to tone. They note who is late, who appears distracted, who speaks carelessly, who preserves form under pressure. Carlota seems to have understood instinctively that monarchy communicates not only through decrees, but through atmosphere. A ruler's composure can become, for others, an argument that order persists. This placed another subtle burden upon her, for it meant that her own self-command was part of the empire's visible structure. She had to remain measured so that others might continue to believe. Such expectations are common in royal life, but under conditions of instability they become more exacting. A princess may be admired for elegance. An empress in a contested state must also radiate endurance. Carlota, trained from childhood in restraint, was capable of this, but capability does not make the effort weightless. In the provinces, events continued to remind the court that no imperial dignity could fully quiet resistance. Juarez remained a living center of opposition, and the Republican cause, though pressed, endured with stubborn vitality. Reports from beyond the capital brought news that could never be entirely soothing. Victories were followed by reverses, assurances by new uncertainties, moments of outward calm by reminders that the empire's reach was uneven. The very vastness of Mexico, which had once contributed to the grandeur of the imperial vision, now intensified its difficulty. Distances were long, communications imperfect, loyalties varied, and the project of imposing unity from above moved against the grain of a country already shaped by years of conflict. Carlota's regencies, her councils, her correspondence, all took place beneath this knowledge. To govern was to govern amid incompletion. There is something particularly melancholic in the image of a conscientious sovereign working hardest at the very moment when the structure she serves is growing less secure. Carlota's devotion during these years carries that melancholy. She was not retreating into illusion, nor, however, was she yet yielding to resignation. She occupied the middle space between them, where duty still appears meaningful and perhaps decisive, even as events begin to suggest otherwise. This is often the most human phase of political tragedy, because it preserves both lucidity and hope. Carlota could see strain. She could feel the narrowing margin of safety. She could recognize that the empire needed continual effort simply to maintain its posture. And still, she labored. Such labor becomes, in retrospect, one of the purest expressions of her character. Her relationship with Maximilian, shaped now by the demands of rule, also took on a more complex tenderness. They had embarked upon the Mexican venture together, and whatever differences in temperament had emerged, their destinies remained bound. One can imagine moments of consultation between them in the evening, after ministers had withdrawn, when the day's concerns were reviewed in quieter tones. Maximilian, imaginative and often humane in impulse, may have spoken of reform, reconciliation, the moral purpose of their reign. Carlota, clearer in her sense of administrative pressure, may have answered with practical questions, with the details that determine whether ideals survive contact with reality. Such conversations, if they occurred in the spirit one suspects, need not be imagined as quarrels. Rather, they form part of the deeper intimacy of a marriage tested by public burden. They reveal two people trying, each in their own way, to carry a crown that was becoming heavier than either had once envisioned. And yet the language of monarchy required that their burden appear noble even when it felt exhausting. Publicly, they remained emperor and empress, still attended by ritual, still clothed in the dignity of rank, still asked to embody confidence for a court and a cause that depended upon visible assurance. Private fatigue could not easily be displayed, for Carlota especially, whose instinct was to meet pressure with greater application. This may have meant an increasing inwardness. The more responsibility demanded of her, the more fully she entered that disciplined solitude known to many people in high office. One is surrounded by attendants and ministers, yet one's deepest anxieties cannot be entirely shared. The Empress could issue instructions, receive delegations, and preside with calm. Still, beneath the polished surface, the mind remained alone with its calculations. Such solitude need not yet have been tragic. It was, however, the beginning of a more private burden, one that would deepen with time. By 1865 and into 1866, the larger international situation also pressed more ominously upon the empire's horizon. The American Civil War had ended, and with its end came increasing pressure from the United States against continued French intervention in Mexico. Napoleon III, who had helped construct the imperial project, now had his own calculations to consider within Europe and beyond it. Support that once seemed solid began to reveal its conditional nature. Even before the full consequences unfolded, the atmosphere must have changed. What had felt difficult but manageable could begin to feel precarious. Carlota, attentive as ever to the realities beneath appearance, would have sensed the shift. A throne dependent upon another sovereign's military will is never wholly at rest, and once that will begins to waver, every room in the palace acquires a different air. Still, the days continued. Papers arrived. Audiences were held. The Empress read, listened, signed and spoke. Chapultepec stood above the valley in its serene altitude, while the empire below it moved through tensions it could no longer conceal from itself. The mountain light still fell across terraces and city roofs with the same beauty as before. Evening bells still crossed the capital in measured waves. Servants still passed through corridors, candles were still lit, and rooms prepared for conversation retained their cultivated grace. History rarely announces its turning points with sufficient clarity to those living inside them. More often, it reveals itself gradually through a thickening of concern, a new caution in speech, a growing sense that what once seemed difficult is becoming delicate. Carlota lived now in that delicate interval, still acting, still hoping through work, while around her the empire narrowed into something more strained and more lonely than it had been at its radiant beginning. If one lingers with her in these months, it is not the spectacle of power that remains most vivid, but the image of a woman seated at a desk in a high room overlooking the valley, the late light fading on papers spread before her, the air cooling after the heat of the day, and the sounds of the palace softened by distance. She has come far from the ordered gardens of Laeken and the sea terraces of Miramar. She is now Empress Carlota of Mexico, and she is trying with all the discipline she possesses to make that title mean something durable in a world that is quietly withdrawing its guarantees. There is dignity in this effort, and sadness too, though the sadness has not yet ripened into grief. For the moment, it remains suspended, like evening mist along the hills, barely visible unless one looks with care. And so, the chapter of labour closes not in collapse, but in a deepening hush, as the empire still stands, still beautiful in form, and yet more than ever dependent upon the vigilance of those who know how fragile beautiful things can be. By the summer of 1866, the air around the Mexican empire had changed so completely that even its silences felt altered. What had once seemed fragile yet workable now stood beneath a thinning sky of support, and the truth that had long existed at the edges of imperial life could no longer be held at a distance. Napoleon III, whose power had helped lift Maximilian and Carlota onto their uncertain throne, had begun to withdraw the French troops on which the empire so heavily depended. The decision came not as a sudden thunderclap, but as the hard settling of realities that had been gathering for some time. Pressure from abroad, shifting calculations in Europe, the exhaustion of intervention, and the cold logic by which great powers abandon what no longer serves them. For Maximilian and Carlota, the meaning was unmistakable. Without French arms, the imperial structure in Mexico would stand exposed to forces it had never fully subdued. In the high rooms of Chapultepec and the more official gravity of the capital, the days still carried on with their accustomed forms, yet beneath them moved the knowledge that form alone could not preserve a throne whose foundations were being removed. Carlota met this new crisis as she had met earlier ones, not by turning away, but by moving toward it with all the force of her disciplined nature. If there remained even a slender possibility that Europe might be persuaded to save the empire it had helped create, she was willing to pursue it. The decision that she should travel across the Atlantic to seek support was born not of theatrical impulse, but of grim necessity. She would go herself, not as a decorative empress making a ceremonial return, but as a sovereign woman attempting to hold together, by personal appeal, a political world that was already beginning to loosen its grip. There is something deeply sorrowful in such a journey, because it reverses the confidence of the first voyage. 2 years earlier, she had crossed the ocean in imperial expectation, with titles before her and a future opening in the distance. Now she prepared to leave Mexico not in triumph but in anxiety, carrying with her the burden of an empire that could no longer sustain itself unaided. The same sea that had once borne her toward promise would now receive her as a petitioner. Her departure from Mexico in July of 1866 must have been shadowed by a painful doubleness. She left behind the country to which she had tried, with visible sincerity, to give her labour, her study, and her sense of duty. She also left behind Maximilian, whose fate was now bound to the unstable ground she was sailing away from, and whose hopes, however bruised, had not yet wholly yielded. To part under such conditions is to be divided not only by distance but by uncertainty. One can imagine the final days before departure as charged with controlled emotion. Consultations, last arrangements, conversations weighed down by all that could not be secured, and around them the enduring beauty of Mexico itself, the mountain light, the high air, the courtyards and terraces now touched by the knowledge that she might not soon see them again. Yet if sorrow accompanied her leaving, determination accompanied it also. Carlota still believed that action might alter the course of events. She did not sail as one defeated. She sailed as one who meant, if possible, to rescue. The Atlantic crossing that followed must have possessed a very different stillness from the one that had carried her westward in 1864. Then the sea had been a threshold, a luminous expanse between one royal life and another. Now it became an interval of suspense, an immense distance through which thought moved restlessly. On shipboard, separated from the immediate demands of the Mexican court, yet unable to escape its peril, Carlota would have lived among telegrams, letters, recollections and calculations, her mind turning continually toward Europe and the responses she hoped to compel there. The horizon, unchanged in its outward calm, could no longer offer innocence. She was returning to the continent of her birth not as a princess or archduchess in graceful circulation among courts, but as an empress whose authority was endangered and whose realm stood in need of soldiers, money, and political will. The sea held her in that suspended condition for days together, while Mexico receded into memory and Europe approached not as refuge, but as tribunal. Paris was the first and most necessary destination, for it was in Paris that the empire's living source of support had always truly resided. Napoleon III had been not merely an ally, but, in a profound sense, one of the authors of the Mexican venture itself. If he withdrew fully, the imperial project would be left exposed before enemies whose patience had already outlasted much. Carlota therefore came to France with urgency sharpened by personal appeal. She sought audiences, pressed arguments, and tried to awaken in Napoleon both responsibility and resolve. The case she made was not frivolous. France had helped create this throne. It could not abandon it without abandoning those who had accepted it in good faith. Yet courts, even when they speak kindly, often answer desperation with a studied gentleness more painful than open refusal. Napoleon received her, but the reassurance she needed could not be drawn from him. His interest had cooled. His wider concerns had moved elsewhere. The empire in Mexico had become a burden he no longer wished to bear. Between Carlota's earnest insistence and the emperor's evasive realism there opened the gulf no dignity could bridge. The emotional atmosphere of those Paris meetings must have been especially bitter, because France represented not a distant hope, but a betrayed promise. Carlota was not asking a stranger for generosity. She was imploring the architect of a political design not to leave its human cost to others. One imagines her in those rooms of imperial France, still carrying herself with all the self-command of her rank, speaking with clarity and force, seeking some opening through which duty, prestige, or compassion might yet be stirred. Around her stood the polished surfaces of European power, mirrors, uniforms, marble, curtains drawn against bright summer light, all the visual language of decision and command. And yet, behind the refinement, there was only retreat. Napoleon III did not offer the decisive support she sought. His manner may have been courteous, even regretful, but regret without action is a cold comfort to those watching a world collapse. In Paris, Carlota must have felt for the first time not merely the difficulty of her mission, but the possibility that Europe had already begun to close itself against her. From France she moved on, carrying the strain of disappointment into the next chambers of appeal. Vienna drew her back into the older dynastic world of the Habsburgs, that vast family system into which she had married when life still seemed full of ascending promise. It was there, if anywhere beyond Paris, that blood, name, and imperial kinship might have been expected to answer with warmth. Yet dynasties, for all their language of family, are often governed by caution and injury as much as by affection. Maximilian's acceptance of the Mexican crown had not pleased all within the Austrian imperial house, and the distance between the Mexican adventure and the settled interests of Vienna had only grown with time. Carlota came not to revisit old splendors, but to seek practical aid, moral backing, and some sign that Maximilian's own family would not leave him isolated. What she encountered instead was reserve, reluctance, and the painful insufficiency of sympathy, if Paris had. Disappointed her politically, Vienna may have wounded her more inwardly, because it revealed how little even dynastic closeness could secure when prudence had already hardened into refusal. To move from court to court in such a state is exhausting in a manner deeper than physical fatigue. Every palace doorway promises the possibility of intervention. Every conversation begins under the discipline of hope. Every leave-taking, if nothing has been granted, adds a new layer of abandonment. Carlota had always possessed unusual powers of self-command, but self-command is not an endless reservoir. It depends upon some faith that effort remains meaningful. In Paris and Vienna, that faith was tested relentlessly. The woman who had crossed the ocean to reign now crossed drawing rooms, corridors, antechambers, and official salons as a suppliant of history, asking Europe not to discard the consequences of its own ambition. She was still young, still intellectually sharp, still animated by purpose, yet the ground under her purpose was dissolving. What had once been the clear discipline of duty began to meet a harder condition: the repeated discovery that those most able to help had already decided not to do so. By the time she went on to Rome, the journey had acquired the quality of a pilgrimage undertaken after the ordinary resources of politics have nearly failed. Rome offered no armies and no practical guarantee of restoration, yet it still represented authority of another kind, ancient, sacred, and emotionally charged for a Catholic empress whose world had always been shaped by the ceremonials of faith as well as of monarchy. To seek an audience, there was to move beyond diplomacy toward appeal in its most exposed form. The city itself, with its churches, courtyards, great facades, and long memories of empire and devotion, would have met her in a mood both magnificent and remote. Pilgrims and prelates, bells in warm air, the slow turning of carriage wheels over old stone, shadows falling across colonnades in the late afternoon. All this belonged to a Rome that could seem to gather the centuries around one person's immediate distress and yet offer no human certainty in return. Carlota arrived there carrying not only political disappointment, but growing inner strain, and Rome, instead of soothing it, became the place where that strain could no longer remain contained. It is important to approach these days with tenderness and restraint. Carlota's mind did not fail in the language of spectacle. It became troubled under pressures that had been accumulating for years. Pressures of isolation, imperial burden, political defeat, and the repeated collapse of trust. In Rome, after the refusals and evasions of Paris and Vienna, signs of profound mental distress emerged more clearly. She became fearful, suspicious, and increasingly unable to believe that the world around her was safe. Accounts from the period speak of paranoia, especially fear of being poisoned, and of a deepening agitation that made ordinary reassurances lose their power. Such fear, once it enters the mind in exhausted circumstances, can transform every gesture of hospitality into possible danger, every offered cup into uncertainty, every courteous phrase into something unstable. The sadness of Carlota's condition lies partly in this. The very structures of civilization and protection to which she had turned for help no longer felt secure to her. She had come to Europe seeking rescue in its palaces and sacred precincts, and there she began to feel endangered even within them. Her audience with Pope Pius IX is one of the most sorrowful episodes of the whole story, not because it is sensational, but because it reveals so quietly the extent of her desperation. She sought spiritual comfort and perhaps some form of shelter in the presence of the pontiff. Yet after the interview, her fear had grown so acute that she did not wish to leave. Rome, instead of resolving into reverence and consolation, became a place where she moved under the weight of distrust, exhaustion, and mental confusion. She reportedly feared what might be given to her, feared food and drink, feared the intentions of those around her, and clung to the few spaces that still seemed momentarily safe. The image is a deeply human one. An empress, reared amid the most refined codes of Europe, no longer able to rest within the very protections those codes had once promised. Whatever had sustained her through childhood, marriage, voyage, and rule was giving way under strain too great for the mind to hold in order. Those around her, confronted now not simply with an imperial crisis, but with Carlota's own suffering, could not easily restore what had begun to fracture. Courtiers, relatives, churchmen, physicians, attendants, all belonged to a world in which royal distress was managed through layers of privacy, discretion, and containment. But privacy does not heal what has already passed beyond its walls. Carlota's fear and suspicion deepened. The collapse of political hope had crossed into a more inward collapse of trust itself. It is possible, looking back, to see in this the tragic convergence of many burdens, a life trained for discipline meeting circumstances beyond discipline, a woman of exceptional seriousness discovering that earnest effort could no longer command outcomes, and a deeply invested sovereign finding herself abandoned by the very continent that had sent her to reign. Yet such retrospective understanding would have offered little comfort at the time. In the immediate experience of those weeks, there would only have been bewilderment, sorrow, and the painful recognition that the woman who had crossed continents in the service of empire could no longer return unchanged to any former self. And all the while, Mexico remained across the ocean, growing more distant not only geographically, but psychically, as if it were already passing from lived present into a realm of irrevocable separation. Carlota had left intending to come back with support, with assurances, with the strength needed to preserve Maximilian and the throne they had built together. Instead, she found herself arrested in Europe by the failure of diplomacy and the onset of severe illness. The return journey never came. The roads that had led her from Paris to Vienna and Rome did not bend again toward Veracruz, toward Chapultepec, toward the valley whose air and history she had labored to know. Without any public declaration of finality, the fact established itself quietly and absolutely. Carlota would not go back to Mexico. The country that had once become the center of her duty now remained on the far side of a distance no ship would close for her. There is a particular melancholy in this kind of absence, because it unfolds before its full meaning can be born. Maximilian remained in Mexico, still within the shrinking circle of imperial fate, while Carlota existed now in another reality altogether, one composed of care, removal, and increasing inward distress. The ocean between them, once the medium of shared ambition, had become an almost symbolic division between action and helplessness, between the visible end of empire and the private dissolution of the Empress, who had tried so hard to sustain it. In another sort of story, this separation might be rendered with dramatic violence, but the truth is sadder and quieter. It is the sadness of letters that cannot mend. Events, of decisions made elsewhere, of a mind no longer able to return to the ordered world it once inhabited. Carlota's tragedy in 1866 was not only that Europe failed her politically, but that, in the course of seeking aid, she crossed a threshold from which her life would take on an altogether different texture. After Rome, she passed more fully under the supervision of family and attendants, removed from the sphere of active political effort into one of protection and seclusion. The language around her would have softened. Doors would have closed more gently. Decisions about her life would increasingly be made by others. Such transitions are often invisible in official history, which tends to record dates and audiences more readily than the atmosphere of diminished agency. Yet for Carlota, this change was immense. She'd been a woman of movement, intention, and disciplined public purpose. Now the world narrowed around her into smaller rooms, guarded routines, cautious care. The imperial mission that had carried her across the Atlantic had fallen from her hands, and with it much of the outward identity she had spent years shaping. What remained was not peace, not yet, but an altered existence in which memory, fear, and detachment from ordinary political time would slowly become the elements of her days. If one lingers at the end of this chapter, it is perhaps not with the great courts themselves, nor with the documents and refusals that sealed the fate of the Mexican Empire, but with a quieter image. Evening settles over Rome. The heat of the day recedes from stone walls and paved courtyards. Bells sound in the distance with that grave, measured sweetness peculiar to old Catholic cities. Somewhere within guarded rooms, an empress who had crossed oceans for a crown sits far from the country she had tried to serve, exhausted beyond diplomacy, surrounded now not by the hopes of empire, but by the first enclosing stillness of a long withdrawal. Mexico remains on the horizon of memory, luminous and unreachable, while Europe, which once seemed the source of order, grows dim and uncertain around her. And in that deepening hush, the journey that was meant to save a throne passes almost imperceptibly into another kind of voyage, one away from power, away from return, and into silence. When the summer of 1866 arrived, the empire in Mexico still retained its outward forms, its palaces, uniforms, audiences, and the ceremonious language of sovereignty. Yet beneath those forms, a quiet undoing had already begun. French support, on which so much had depended from the first, was no longer assured. Napoleon III, who had once helped imagine the Mexican throne into being, was now withdrawing from the enterprise with the cool discretion of a ruler turning away from an inconvenient design. For Carlota, who had given herself to the imperial role with unusual seriousness, the meaning of this could not be softened by diplomatic phrases. If France stepped back, the empire would stand exposed before enemies who had never accepted it, and before realities that dignity alone could not master. The rooms of Chapultepec still opened toward the valley. The mountain air still entered high windows in the evening, and the city below still moved beneath church towers and drifting light, but the atmosphere had changed. Beauty remained, yet it no longer carried reassurance. The visible world held its grace while the hidden structure of support began to loosen. Carlota did not meet this crisis with passivity. Her instinct, formed by upbringing and strengthened through rule, was to act while action still seemed possible. If Europe had created the conditions under which the Mexican crown had been offered, then Europe, she believed, might still be compelled to defend what it had helped establish. The decision that she should return across the Atlantic to seek support was therefore not a gesture of ceremony, but one of urgent necessity. She would go herself, carrying the appeal not through intermediaries, but in her own person, as empress, wife, and daughter of royal houses long practiced in the languages of duty and dynastic obligation. There was courage in this, though of a quiet and sorrowful kind. She was leaving behind not only a court and a throne, but the country to which she had tried, in earnest and with labour, to attach herself. She sailed not because she wished to withdraw from Mexico, but because she hoped, with a last disciplined faith, to save it. The departure from Mexican soil must have been touched by a feeling difficult to name, half purpose and half foreboding. The same land that had once received her in the bright uncertainty of imperial beginnings now stood before her as something endangered, perhaps already slipping beyond recovery. She left Maximilian behind, and the separation itself carried a painful weight. Their enterprise had been shared from the beginning, whatever their differences of temperament, and now she was setting out alone into a Europe that had grown less intimate and less reliable than memory might once have suggested. One imagines the final days in Mexico in subdued tones, consultations in shaded rooms, letters arranged, routes fixed, servants moving through corridors with careful quiet, and beyond the windows, the enduring loveliness of the valley, unchanged by political distress. Carlota had come to know Mexico not merely as a title or abstraction, but as a place of air, landscape, history, and effort. To leave it at such a moment was not only a political act, it was an inward wound, though one she would scarcely have allowed herself to dwell upon while duty still demanded motion. The Atlantic crossing, undertaken now in anxiety rather than expectation, must have altered every memory of the earlier voyage. In 1864, the sea had seemed to hold promise in suspension, bearing a young couple toward a grand and uncertain destiny. In 1866, it became instead a vast interval between peril and appeal, a moving solitude in which the mind could find no rest. The ocean has a way of amplifying thought. Its horizons are too broad, its repetitions too calm, its distance from ordinary life too complete. Day after day the ship moved west to east beneath changing skies, and Carlota, confined within the measured life of the voyage, could do little but think ahead to the audiences she must obtain, the arguments she must press, and the shrinking time in which success might still matter. Around her were all the forms of rank, the deference due her title, the routine attentions of travel, and yet beneath them there must have been an almost physical loneliness. The empire in Mexico could not travel with her except in documents, in memory, and in the pressure beating steadily at the center of her thoughts. Paris was the most necessary destination, because Paris lay behind the empire more decisively than official proclamations admitted. Napoleon III had been one of the chief architects of the Mexican venture, and only France possessed the power to preserve it in practical terms. Carlota therefore came before the French emperor, not as a stranger appealing to generosity, but as a sovereign woman calling upon responsibility. She sought support in the language available to her: honor, duty, dynastic seriousness, the obligations created by intervention, the injustice of abandoning a throne whose insecurity had always been bound to French arms. One can picture her entering the polished chambers of Imperial France with all the self-command her station required, still composed in appearance, still speaking from a place of disciplined conviction. Yet the courts of Europe, however refined in manner, were often pitiless in substance. The more she pressed the urgency of Mexico, the more she must have felt how little remained of the enthusiasm that had first sent her there. Napoleon listened, but calculation had already overtaken imagination. Whatever courtesy he offered, it could not conceal retreat. There is a particularly bitter form of disappointment reserved for those who discover that the author of their hopes has quietly ceased to believe in them. Carlota had not come to Paris to ask for charity. She had come to ask that France not disclaim the consequences of its own political design. In another mood, in another season of international power, Napoleon III might have spoken more boldly, might have prolonged support, might have chosen appearance over prudence for a little longer. But by 1866, his wider concerns lay elsewhere. Pressure from the United States, changing circumstances in Europe, and the waning appeal of the Mexican project had all contributed to a colder view. For Carlota, this meant that the very centre from which imperial strength had once seemed to flow now answered with hesitation and withdrawal. The formal elegance of the French court could not soften that truth. One may leave a room having been received with perfect civility and still feel abandoned. Indeed, abandonment is sometimes most painful when it comes wrapped in the language of sympathy. From Paris she went on, carrying with her not triumph, but the first deeper exhaustion of refusal. Vienna, the city of Habsburg memory and imperial continuity, drew her back toward the family into which she had married when life still seemed to promise expansion rather than contraction. There, among people tied to Maximilian by blood and to Carlota by marriage, one might imagine some warmer response, some movement of dynastic loyalty strong enough to transcend caution. Yet the old European courts were places where kinship and prudence rarely stood in simple harmony. Maximilian's Mexican crown had long been entangled with ambivalence in Austrian eyes, admired by some perhaps as daring, regarded by others as unwise from the beginning. To approach Vienna under such circumstances was to place hope before a tribunal already inclined toward restraint. Carlota came asking not for sentiment, but for help, for recognition that the imperial house could not entirely leave one of its own to the fate of a collapsing experiment. What she encountered, however, was sympathy without rescue, regret without decisive action, the soft but impenetrable wall of dynastic caution. That is often the most wearing kind of failure, because it denies one the clarity of open hostility. No door is slammed, no insult is offered. One is received, heard, perhaps even pitied. Yet when the audience ends, nothing has changed. The distances between one palace and the next begin to feel immense, not because of geography alone, but because each new setting repeats the same painful pattern. Carlota, who had always brought seriousness to whatever role she inhabited, continued to press her case with dignity, but dignity cannot create willingness where the will has already withdrawn. She passed through interiors made for majesty, through antechambers and council rooms where portraits of ancestors looked down upon the living, and everywhere the same refined insufficiency met her. The Europe that had once formed her seemed now to recognize her rank while denying her need. She had been sent to reign in the new world under the aura of imperial support. Now, returned to the old, she found that aura dissolving around her. There comes a point in such journeys when fatigue no longer belongs merely to the body. It settles instead upon trust itself. Carlota had left Mexico believing that effort, argument, presence, and personal appeal might still call forth assistance from those most responsible for the empire's condition. After Paris and Vienna, the burden of repeated disappointment began to fall inward. One can imagine how the mind, disciplined for years toward order and duty, might begin to strain under such conditions. Every new interview demanded hope. Every courteous refusal made hope more difficult to summon again. She had crossed an ocean to save a realm and a husband. She moved now through the great capitals of her own civilization, and with each failure the world of dynasties and high politics, once so legible to her, grew more obscure and less trustworthy. The very codes in which she had been raised no longer seemed to guarantee protection. Beneath the polished continuity of courtly life, something more intimate had begun to fray. Rome received her in that altered state. If Paris was political power and Vienna dynastic memory, Rome offered something older and more solemn, a city where monarchy, faith, and the long theatre of human petition had accumulated over centuries beneath stone, incense, and bell sound. To go there after the failures elsewhere was to move, in some sense, beyond diplomacy into supplication. For a Catholic empress whose life had always unfolded within the ceremonial nearness of religion, Rome must have carried an emotional charge unlike that of any secular court. Yet old cities do not console merely because they are ancient, and sacred places cannot undo the injuries already carried into them. Carlota arrived in Rome burdened by disappointment, fear for Mexico, fear for Maximilian, and the inward exhaustion of having asked so much of people determined to give so little. The city around her may have seemed august and still, its courtyards warm under afternoon light, its churches cool in shadow, its facades preserving the composure of centuries. But inwardly, the strain had become too great to remain hidden behind form. It is here that her story must be told, with the greatest gentleness. Carlota's suffering in Europe was not a spectacle, and it should never be treated as one. After the repeated failures of her mission, signs of profound mental distress emerged more visibly. Fear took hold where confidence had once lived. Suspicion began to darken the ordinary gestures of hospitality and care. Accounts from the time speak of paranoia, of a growing conviction that danger surrounded her, and of a mind no longer able to trust the safeguards once offered by etiquette, rank, or religious authority. Such changes rarely arrive in a single moment. They gather under exhaustion, loneliness, and disappointment, until the familiar world seems altered beyond recognition. For Carlota, who had long relied upon discipline to steady herself, this loss of inner certainty must have been a sorrow beyond language. The empress who had come to plead for an empire now found that even the simple acts of receiving food, drink, or reassurance could no longer be approached without fear. Her audience with Pope Pius IX, so often recalled in brief historical summaries, is moving less for its political significance than for its emotional atmosphere. She came seeking refuge of some kind, perhaps consolation, perhaps confirmation that there still existed in Europe a moral shelter not entirely dissolved by calculation. Yet after the meeting, her distress did not subside. If anything, Rome became the place where her trust in the world most visibly broke apart. She feared poison. She feared betrayal. She clung anxiously to places and persons that, for fleeting moments, seemed safe. There is no need to heighten such scenes with dramatic language. Their sadness is already complete. A royal woman raised within the most formal protections of 19th century Europe had reached a condition in which those protections no longer felt real. The old institutions remained around her in all their grandeur, but they could not restore the inner order that strain and abandonment had undone. Those who attended her, whether relatives, servants, clerics, or physicians, were now confronted with a different reality from the one that had first brought her across the Atlantic. The mission to save the Mexican Empire was no longer merely failing. It had become inseparable from Carlota's own collapse into fear and instability. In such circumstances, the world tends to narrow quietly. Decisions are removed from the afflicted person's hands. Movements become supervised. Rooms become guarded. speech softens. The political language of audiences and appeals gives way to the more private language of care. For Carlota, this was an immense and tragic alteration. She had been a woman of purpose, of administration, of resolve. She had travelled across oceans to act in history. Now history receded from her as practical agency diminished. What remained was the painful immediacy of distress and the growing fact that she would not return to the country in whose service she had undertaken all this. And so Mexico began to pass from present reality into something more like a luminous and unreachable distance. The Valley of Mexico, the high air of Chapultepec, the courtyards, documents, ceremonies, and even the anxieties of daily governance now stood on the far side of an ocean and of an inward threshold she could no longer cross back over. She had departed intending to rescue an empire and rejoin Maximilian with renewed support. Instead, Europe had refused her petitions, and the strain of refusal had overtaken her mind so deeply that the journey back became impossible. She never returned to Mexico. The fact settles gently but irreversibly into the story, like evening light fading from stone. A chapter of her life had closed not by formal declaration, but by the silent accumulation of failure, exhaustion, and illness. The Empress, who had tried so carefully to belong in a distant land, was now fixed in Europe, separated forever from the place where she had most fully attempted to fulfill her destiny. From this point onward, the character of her life changed. The swift movements of diplomacy ceased. The hopeful energy of intervention gave way to supervision, seclusion, and a more inward existence arranged by others. Yet at the end of this chapter, before the long silence fully descends, it is possible to linger for a moment with the image of Carlota in those European days after Rome, no longer moving with imperial purpose from court to court, but enclosed within a world grown uncertain, listening perhaps to distant bells or muted carriage wheels in a city that could not save her, while beyond all reach Mexico remained in memory, sunlit and sorrowful, as if preserved forever in the still air of a country she had left only for a season and lost for the rest of her life. In June of 1867, while Carlota remained in Europe, removed now from the active world of courts and embassies, the final act of the Mexican Empire was completed far away under the hard light of Querétaro. Maximilian, abandoned by the foreign support on which his throne had depended and unable or unwilling to save himself through flight, was captured by Republican forces and condemned to death. On the 19th of June, he was executed, and with him the imperial dream to which Carlota had crossed an ocean was extinguished in formal and public terms. Yet for her story, the deepest force of this moment lies not in the manner of his death, but in the silence that followed it. The husband with whom she had once stood on ship decks and in palace halls, imagining an empire made honourable by effort and conviction, now belonged to memory. Mexico, which had once seemed the great stage of her destiny, passed beyond recovery. What remained for Carlota was not the drama of empire, but the long and far quieter burden of outliving it. News in the 19th century could travel swiftly enough across borders, yet grief did not always arrive in a single clear form, especially in a life already clouded by illness and seclusion. The world around Carlota understood that a chapter had ended forever. The imperial experiment in Mexico was over. The emperor was dead. Europe, which had hesitated when action was still possible, now received the tidings with the grave decorum reserved for fallen princes and failed adventures. But Carlota herself had already entered another inward country, one less governed by diplomatic sequence than by fear, exhaustion, and withdrawal. It is often said that she never recovered, and this is true, though such a phrase can sound too abrupt for the reality it describes. Her life did not simply break and stop. It altered. It narrowed. It drew away from the visible movement of history while continuing, season after season, for another 60 years. That is the peculiar sorrow of her fate. The catastrophe was brief. The aftermath was almost a lifetime. In the years immediately after Maximilian's death, Carlota moved more fully into a world of protection, supervision, and guarded domestic routine. Her family, attendants, and physicians became the mediators of her days. The public offices of Empress and Regent, once carried with such application, disappeared from use, though not entirely from memory. She was still a princess by birth, still a royal widow in the eyes of Europe, but these titles no longer opened onto action. They had become relics of an interrupted life. The spaces she inhabited changed accordingly. They were residences in which she could be kept from the strain of political society, where her care could be arranged with discretion, and where those around her might preserve the dignity of her station while quietly limiting the world to which she had access. In such places, curtains were drawn or opened according to habit. Meals arrived at appointed hours. Gardens changed with the seasons. And outside the gates, the great traffic of European life continued without needing anything from her. At first, there was still, perhaps, the lingering emotional temperature of recent calamity. Those close to her would have remembered the Mexican years vividly. The names of Maximilian, Mexico City, Chapultepec, Querétaro, Paris, Vienna, and Rome still belong to living memory, not yet to historical distance. There may have been objects nearby that carried the echo of that vanished world. Letters, portraits, pieces of furniture, gifts, devotional items, official papers folded and stored away, all the mute possessions through which a lost life remains present after it can no longer be resumed. For Carlota, however, time did not move cleanly from event to reflection. Illness had disrupted the ordinary relation between past and present. The mind that had once managed duties with disciplined clarity could not now be asked simply to receive tragedy, order it, and place it among recollections. Her distress did not convert itself into noble resignation. It remained part of the texture of her existence, altering the way she inhabited rooms, trusted others, and passed through the years. And so the world around her learned to become smaller and more regular. There is something almost monastic in the shape such lives can take, though without the chosen serenity of a convent cell. A secluded royal existence is built from repetition, familiar. Corridors, known attendants, recurring meals, walks when weather permits, devotional habits, preferred objects, fixed hours of rising and rest, the sound of doors opening and closing in the same sequence day after day. For a woman once carried between capitals and continents by affairs of empire, such repetition might seem from the outside unbearably narrow. Yet routine can also serve as a kind of shelter, especially when the larger world has become too charged with fear or confusion. Carlota's later life, lived largely apart from public society, settled into this enclosed rhythm. if one imagines her not as a figure frozen in a single moment of crisis, but as a living person carried forward through decades, one begins to see how much of her existence was made not of drama, but of quiet continuance. She spent time in several royal residences before the long final phase of her seclusion took firmer shape in Belgium. Tervuren, with its wooded calm and older ducal associations, offered one setting for this withdrawn life. Later, Bouchoux, the moated chateau near Meze, would become the place most closely bound to her final decades. Bouchoux was not an imperial palace of the grandest sort, but a more contained and inward residence, surrounded by grounds that allowed for privacy, distance, and the measured passing of the seasons. There is a certain appropriateness in that setting. Carlota, once Empress of Mexico, ended not amid the great ceremonial capitals of the world, but in a quieter enclosure of trees, water, paths, gardens, and long familiar rooms. The contrast is moving not because it is theatrical, but because it is so gentle. History had once placed a crown upon her head in a distant land beneath mountain light. Now it left her in northern stillness, where mist might gather over lawns and autumn leaves fall softly into the moat. Her brother, who became Leopold II of Belgium, stood in the background of these years as the reigning monarch under whose authority her care and maintenance were secured. Royal families, whatever their private complexities, knew how to preserve appearances and provide for their own in ways both practical and symbolic. Carlota's status ensured that she was not abandoned materially, and the decorum surrounding her life remained intact. Yet the very discretion with which such care was offered could deepen the sense of disappearance. She was looked after, but she was also set aside. The woman who had once tried to govern in Mexico and had spoken with emperors and popes now lived increasingly outside the active concerns of dynastic politics. Visitors, when admitted, would have entered a world already separated from ordinary chronology, a place where the routines of the household mattered more than the movements of ministries or the transformations of Europe. In this way, seclusion became not merely a circumstance, but a climate. The decades passed, and with them, the 19th century itself moved toward its later autumn. Around Carlota, Europe changed in ways immense and irreversible. New generations took the place of those who had known the Mexican adventure at first hand. Statesmen died. Courts altered in tone. Railways expanded. Industry deepened. Cities grew louder and larger. And imperial rivalries hardened in the background of continental life. Yet within the bounds of her secluded existence, time would have been marked less by these broad shifts than by the recurring signs of age and season. Trees leafed and shed. Winters settled over Belgium with their pale skies and damp cold. Spring returned to gardens and paths. Servants came and went. Relatives were lost. The faces around her changed gradually. Such long continuities create a peculiar form of historical contrast. Outside, Europe hurried onward into modernity. Inside, one royal life seemed almost suspended, living under the spell of events that belonged increasingly to another era. There are some afterlives of tragedy, in which the afflicted person becomes a symbol, reduced by history to a single phrase, a single portrait, a single whispered condition. Carlota has often suffered this simplification, yet the truth of her long seclusion is more human and more difficult than any emblem can express. She was not simply the mad empress, as unkind language has sometimes preferred to remember her. She was a woman who had been rigorously educated, politically serious, capable of real administrative work, and deeply invested in the role she accepted. When her mind grew ill, it did not erase the dignity of the life that had come before. If anything, that earlier discipline lends the later years their deeper sadness. One does not look upon her withdrawal as the exposure of some hidden absurdity. One looks upon it as the survival of a person after too much strain, too much loss, and too complete an abandonment by the structures she had trusted. At Bushu, and in the other residences associated with her later life, memory must have lingered in complex ways. Royal household preserved the past through portraits, family references, anniversary observances, and the habits of speech that keep old names circulating long after their immediate significance has waned. Carlota could not have lived entirely outside those echoes. Somewhere in rooms or cupboards, there were likenesses of Maximilian, mementos of Mexico, and reminders that she had once borne a title connected to another continent. Yet memory in such a life is not always a clear and orderly archive. It may come and go in broken lights, in gestures, in sudden recognitions, in anxieties attached to objects or places, in the odd persistence of certain years while others fade. The past was not absent from her seclusion. It was woven into it, sometimes tenderly, sometimes painfully, always at a distance that could not be fully crossed. As Carlota grew older, her own body, like the century around her, underwent its gradual transformations. The youthful Princess of Laeken, the Archduchess at Miramar, the Empress at Chapultepec, all these selves retreated further into the archive of photographs and recollection. Age settled upon her features. The poise that had once animated official receptions gave way to the quieter bearing of an elderly royal woman, moving through enclosed spaces, attended rather than attending, observed rather than observing. There is an austere beauty in such old age when it is met within silence. One imagines soft woolen fabrics in colder weather, shawls, carefully maintained rooms, chairs placed by windows, the muted sound of steps on carpet or polished floorboards, and beyond the glass, the patient change of light across Belgian grounds. Time, which had once driven her from court to court and ocean to ocean, now moved more slowly, not because it had actually softened, but because her life no longer required her to answer it in public. Then, in the early 20th century, Europe entered its own great convulsion, and even the quiet precincts of seclusion could not remain wholly untouched. The world that had made and unmade empires in Carlota's youth now moved toward catastrophe on a scale unimaginable when she had first crossed the Atlantic. Belgium itself endured the trauma of invasion during the First World War, and Carlota, by then very old, lived through those years at Bushu. It is one of the strangest aspects of her life that she survived long enough to witness, however indirectly, the suffering of her own country under foreign occupation. The young princess born into a new and carefully guarded Belgian monarchy now lingered into an age of trenches, artillery, and mass destruction. The refined dynastic world of her childhood, with its measured etiquette and guarded alliances, had not vanished entirely, but it had been transformed almost beyond recognition. One may wonder what such upheavals meant to her inwardly, how much of the world's alteration reached her through the filters of care and seclusion. Yet even if those events touched her only dimly, Their presence deepens the historical pathos of her longevity. She belonged by origin to one Europe and by survival to another. After the war, the old world seemed still more remote. Thrones had fallen elsewhere. Dynasties that once appeared immovable had disappeared. The Habsburg Empire, in whose orbit her marriage had first raised her into wider historical significance, was gone. The vast imperial framework that had once made her Mexican adventure imaginable had dissolved into fragments and successor states. Carlota, meanwhile, remained. There is something almost spectral in this persistence, though not in a ghostly sense. She was rather like a surviving piece of an earlier century, still living in flesh, while the political architecture around her had crumbled. Visitors or later observers could see in her not only a private tragedy, but the survival of a whole vanished atmosphere of monarchy. Yet if that thought lends her figure a certain historical grandeur, it should not obscure the quieter truth. She continued simply because life, having once withdrawn her from action, still went on in her body day after day. Survival is not always dramatic. Often it is only repetitive, patient and inward. In the last years, Bushu must have seemed less like a retreat than like the total world of her remaining existence. By then, she had outlived Maximilian by many decades. She had outlived her father, her mother, many of her siblings, and most of those who had directly shared the Mexican years. The memories of 1864, 1866, and 1867 belonged no longer to public urgency, but to the quiet past of an old woman whose life had become almost entirely private. The chateau, the moat, the trees, the familiar servants and attendants, the small patterns of the household, these were the enduring forms that enclosed her. One can imagine long afternoons of muted light, rain touching windows, summer greenery thickening around the grounds, winter mornings pale and cold, bells in the distance, and inside all the careful continuities by which a great sadness is carried not to resolution, but simply onward. She died in 1927, at the age of 86, after a life far longer than the empire for which she is remembered. The year itself belongs already to another age. By then, the world had entered the era of motor cars, wireless communication, and post-war disillusion. Much that had seemed fixed when she was born had altered or vanished. Yet her death closed a life whose deepest emotional center still lay in the 19th century, in the years of marriage, voyage, Mexico, and irretrievable loss. She was buried in Belgium, returned at last in death to the country where her story had begun, under the careful eye of Leopold I. If one views her life in a single sweep, the movement is almost unbearably gentle in its arc. From royal childhood to brilliant marriage, from imperial hope to abandonment, from a brief season of power to 60 years of secluded survival. Few figures in modern history embody so fully the difference between a public catastrophe and a private afterlife. And perhaps that is the image with which her story most softly comes to rest. Not the young empress entering Mexico City beneath the burden of hope, nor the desperate traveller moving from Paris to Vienna to Rome, nor even the widowed recluse in the first shock of loss, but the very old Carlota in the quiet of Bushu, long after the voices of her century had faded. Outside, Belgian weather passes over water and trees. Inside, the rooms hold their familiar order. Portraits remain on walls. Footsteps are subdued. The world that once called her across the sea has fallen silent. and the empire for which she gave so much has become only history, receding year by year into books, memories, and the tender dimness of distance. At last, there is no court to persuade, no petition to make, no ocean to cross. There is only the hush of an enclosed life coming gently to its end, and with it the last faint echo of an imperial dream disappearing into stillness,